Hey guys, my name is Emma and today I've got my October reading wrap up for you. So I read 15 books in the month of October, 7 of which were in Spookathon and the other 8 were outside of that. I think 2 of them were audiobooks and the rest were either physical or ebooks. So I'm going to run through mainly the ones that weren't in Spookathon because I do have a wrap up for Spookathon which I've tagged down below, but I will give you like kind of a one-line summary of the Spookathon books at the very end of this video. Also, in the month of October I found 2 new favourites, so I'm going to talk about the favourites first. New favourite number 1 is A Natural History of Dragons, which is a memoir by Lady Trent, which is actually written by Marie Brennan. So Lady Trent is the fictional main character in this book. She is if David Attenborough were a Victorian lady obsessed with dragons, which is a slightly bizarre idea, but basically this is her memoir. It's part 1 of 5 as far as I'm aware, and it chronicles her journey from kind of young girl interested in natural science all the way through to becoming the leading dragon expert in her field, and this is her first dragon expedition. Some criticism for this book has been that it is not very action-packed. There's a lot of emphasis on science rather than necessarily like rah scary dragons, but that was exactly why I loved it. I loved her tone, I loved the writing style, the attention to detail was amazing, and it really did feel like a non-fiction memoir travel writing piece that happened to focus on dragons. It's technically set in another world, but it mirrors ours very closely, so the names of countries are different, but you kind of get a sense for where they are. And this one is more of kind of a Peruvian mountain-esque kind of range. Really, really cool. Tugged at my heartstrings so much. There are some character moments in here that, oh my god, so emotional. Like, I actually went and curled up with my partner Andy and was like, I can't believe the book's done this. Like, it really got to me, so it was an amazing book. My other new favourite I technically started in September because I did start it just after the banned bookathon. It was on my TBR for that, and that is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This book is phenomenal. I can so see why it's a modern classic. It tells the story of Yossarian, who is a bombardier or person who flies bomber planes in the Second World War, and it's based very closely on kind of Joseph Heller's own experiences in the war. Plot wise it's a bit weird. It kind of, there isn't really a cohesive plot. It's one of these sort of books that loops around on itself constantly. It's very self-referential and aware of itself. There's a lot of repetition of phrases and jokes, and it's very satirical and absurdist sort of humour. The phrase Catch-22, which refers to kind of a logical continuation, like it's sort of a logical loop which you can't break out of, comes from this, and that is where to be grounded, which means that you don't have to go up and fly any more of the missions, you have to request to have a psych eval to find out that you're crazy, and then you get grounded. But no sane, but if you request a psych eval, then you are sane enough to know that you shouldn't be up there, so therefore you won't get granted. So if you're crazy, then you'll fly, but if you request to be grounded because you're crazy, then you're sane enough that you can then fly. Does that make sense? It loops, and it's one of many loops in this. I've come before in a few other videos to the TV show MASH, which is about the Korean War specifically, but this has very similar kind of feelings to it. So it's that combination of absurdist humour that then builds to sort of climactic points that really just hit you in the gut with emotion, and it really does feel like an entire season of MASH condensed into one book. This came first, by the way, so MASH is very much referential to this. Then I've got kind of a 4-star book which I thought was pretty good but not as amazing as I was hoping it would be, and that is The Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley. This is set in Peru, so it's going to count as my Peru country for my book world tour, so yay, ticking off more for that one. This is again sort of Victorian turn of the century time period where it's a traveller, a scientist and explorer who was injured and can now really no longer go do that. He's got a really bad leg, but then he gets charged with his old company, which is East India Trading Company, to go and find quinine. I kept calling it quinoa when I was talking to other people. It's not quinoa. They're not in the hunt for couscous alternatives. It's quinine, which is basically treatment for malaria. It's found from trees and it's difficult to get a hold of. And they know that there is this big quinine tree section which they can't get to, which is in this particular grove forest area that has a village that the main character's father and grandfather were linked to previously. It's a slow burner. I much preferred the stuff at the end. There is a supernatural element which I won't go into too much detail for because it will spoil the book for you, but I wanted far more from that side of things rather than the build up to it. The world building, it felt very strangely paced. Like, we had a lot of time at the beginning and then it all felt very rushed at the end, which is why I'm only giving it sort of 4 stars, maybe even 3.5. But what I will say is once it got going, I could not put it down. So this was one that the first 2/3 were chugging along really hard work, and then the last third I blitzed in like less than an hour. Another 4-star read that I had is the graphic novel series Revival by Tim Seeley. This was on my Spookathon TBR, but I actually read it after Spookathon technically finished. This is described as a rural noir, and it is about a town in rural America where the dead come back to life. And it's just kind of the townsfolk dealing with that. The main character is very much is a police officer, and then her family, and then there's a reporter, there's a few people in sort of power, and it's just sort of working out what to do with these people who can't die. And is this a sign of like an epidemic? Is this the next zombie crisis? Is this just a sort of a act of God? Is this a miracle? Should we quarantine the town? Should we round up the people? Like, what should we do? They're not zombie-esque, they have full faculty, they are literally themselves back to life. Hey guys, sorry about that. I've had to swap to my phone, my camera battery has died, I can't find my charger. Life is just chaos right now. So you've got phone quality. Yeah, let's just keep going. So I was talking about Revival. The reason why I'm only giving this 4 stars rather than 5 is because there are so many characters and so many plot threads right now that I did find it quite difficult to keep up. I know that with later volumes they will probably wrap up and it will make more sense, but I did feel a little bit lost and confused, especially in book 2, volume 2, which is here. I think the artwork though for these is stunning. It's very pretty. Another kind of 4-star-ish book was The Boy on the Bridge by M.R. Carey. This is book 2, and I think the final book, I think it was a duology from his series. The first one is The Girl with All the Gifts, which I read earlier on this year. It is a zombie survival apocalypse style story. This one I think is weaker than The Girl with All the Gifts. I'd probably give this a 3 or a 3.5 stars, just because the characters in it they're idiots, basically. The humans just do stupid stuff that makes no sense in the long run. So whilst I really enjoyed it and I thought it was very fast paced and the reading experience was very pleasant, when I got to the end of it and then looked back on the book, I was like, what were you all doing? Like, what on earth was that for so many sections of it? There was also a lot of characters which I found a little bit difficult to keep track of, but it did round out the series nicely, and I really liked the last section where it kind of gave a bit of an epilogue and a bit of a more satisfactory ending to the dystopian genre than the dystopian genre generally tends to give. So yeah, it's a kind of 3.5 stars for this one. I also read Replica by Lauren Oliver. This is a YA sci-fi kind of speculative fiction type thing. It is about a girl who has been cloned. She is one of many, because that's how clones work. Well done, Emma. But she's basically in this medical facility. She doesn't really know much about her own life or why she exists or the outside world. There are some boys there as well. It's kind of both are cloned, and then there's a fire and they break out. But then whilst this is also going on, you have the other side, which is a normal teenage girl who finds out something to do with her father, which was linked to these clones. And the idea is that this book, you can read it kind of flipping. So it's actually 2 stories. One goes this way and one goes this way. And then the idea is that they're told from the 2 different girls' points of view. That was the big gimmick that kind of hooked me into reading this book. And I personally don't think that it did that very well. I think it's a gimmick that doesn't add anything to the story. What I ended up doing was I would read kind of 2 or 3 chapters of one of the girls, and then something would happen that would be a bit of a almost spoiler for the other section, like a big plot point that involved both of them, and then I would go back and read the other girl until I got to that point, and I'd continue with her until the next big plot point where I'd then flip again. Because my fear was, by reading all of one and then all of the other, you're kind of inadvertently spoiling the book for yourself. I don't really understand why Lauren Oliver decided to do this whole chapter flipping thing, other than for a marketing gimmick, because personally I think that this story would have worked much better had she intermixed the characters and the chapters properly, because there are clearly some points where there are big reveals where you want to have read it in the right kind of direction, and I think that it would have been fairly easy to do that. You get some duplicated information here that you don't need, you get scenes from both directions, which I don't think you gain anything in those scenes by doing that. You're just repeating content, so I was not particularly impressed with this. The actual story itself was fairly engaging, and I would be inclined to read book 2 to see what happens with them. It also does suffer from your classic YA problem that the teenage girls are both sort of, especially the one who's had more of a normal life, are just obsessed with boys. Like, you're in life-threatening situations in so many instances, like you're being shot at, you're on the run, you don't know what's going on, and you are just being hyper aware of the teenage boy next to you, like, oh my god, he smells so good, and look how good he looks in that jacket, and like, alright, I remember being a teenager, and I remember hormones raging and everything, but I don't believe that you're that sex crazed at that age. Then I'm going to talk about 2 books that I actively did not like that I read in the month of October. One of them I did on audiobook, and that is Idaho by Emily Ruskovich. I listened to probably about half of this in September and finished it off in October. And this was a really weak book as far as I was concerned. It follows loosely a family, which is mum, dad and 2 kids, 2 girls, and they go up into the mountains. It is set in Idaho, hence the name. They go up into the mountains to chop some wood, and then a violent act occurs on this that sort of changes their lives. And it's looking at how that violent act impacts them, and then sort of the immediate circle of people around them, and this sort of ripple effect going out. The problem I had with this was it was just so overwritten. Like, the prose was pretty and was very flowery and flowing, but the characters just were not realistic. Every single character read into moments in life more than you actually do. And maybe I'm just a very shallow person who kind of lets life roll over them, but it's just, they were savouring moments that really didn't feel like moments that needed to be savoured, and they were reading into situations. I really didn't think that you needed to do that. And a really key example of this is, you find out fairly early on in the book, so I don't think it's really a spoiler, that the event that has happened is the mum basically went a little bit nuts and hacked the youngest daughter to death. Yeah, it's a cheerful book. And you also find out very early on in the book that the younger girl's, the one who's been murdered, her piano teacher is having a bit of an emotional affair with the husband. Nothing's actually happened yet, but there is emotional connections between them. The husband's also been taking piano lessons from this teacher, and there is a particular song that they have been sharing, which has been sort of the root of the emotional betrayal. And the piano teacher actually ends up marrying the dad, and they have a whole relationship after all the sort of madness of his first wife going all psycho. But the piano teacher is forever plagued with the idea that she was the root of the woman's sort of psychotic break, and she comes to this like startling realization that it must have been that the little girl was singing the song that was their song together, and that's what triggered the wife, because she knew about his emotional infidelity. And then this little girl May was singing the song, and the woman was like, nah, and just kind of, and you weren't there, you weren't actually at that scene. You're sat in the pickup truck that it happened in, which the guy still owns, by the way, which is bloody creepy. Your daughter was murdered by your first wife in that car, and you still have it. You're weird. But then she sat in the car in the garage 15 years after the event, and she gets struck with this sudden weird past premonition idea that it must have been like this. And you go, no, you don't know that, love. You don't know half the stuff you're saying. You're reading into so many of these situations. You make no sense. And this just was the repeated theme of this book. It went on these sprawling random tangents that were supposed to read into the deep meaningfulness of life, and actually you just come across as pretentious and weird. Like, write poetry. go write poetry, you like pretty prose, that's all you need to do, Emily Ruskovich. The final book is Last Night in Montreal by Emily St. John Mandel. This was her debut novel, and I think the biggest problem about this is you can tell that it's a debut novel. There are the inklings and beginnings of the skill that will then translate to Station 11 later, but she can't pull it off yet. This tells the story of Lilia, who always travels and has been constantly on the move for her entire life, and basically it's because her dad kidnapped her from her mum when she was little, and they've been pretty much on the run ever since. And it's about her connection with a man called Eli when they're sort of fully grown, and she is in a relationship with Eli, but then she decides to leave again because that's what she does. She travels. But Eli's not willing to let her go, so he follows her to Montreal, where he meets a collection of characters who are interlinked with Lilia's story across her life and her travels. Emily St. John Mandel really likes these sort of fleeting moments of meeting and the way that our lives interact, and that's really what Station 11 is about, so I can see where she was coming from with this, but I thought that there were too few characters and not enough happened for this to kind of be pulled off. Another thing that really annoyed me about this book, which is a really weird thing to be annoyed by in a book, is one of the main characters is a tightwire artist. She comes from a family of tightwire artists. Her mum and dad were from the circus originally. They came from a long line of circus family, and then they left, and she is learning the art of tightwire from her grandparents. And as somebody who has travelled with a circus and trained tightwire in a traditional travelling circus and is part of the circus community, Emily St. John Mandel, if you're going to give one of your characters that kind of a quirk, please research how it actually works. Like, the number of people who are going to be bothered by the inaccuracies of how she rigs her tightwire is fairly small, but I am one of them. And that took a book that I already wasn't very happy with and just made it nosedive. Because that's not how you rig things. You're talking about a slack rope most of the time, or something that will kill you most of the time. That definitely won't support your weight, and it's not how you train that. And the descriptions of her on the tightwire were so cliche, and clearly somebody who's never actually tried to balance on something super thin in their life before. Which, again, is a weird thing to be bothered by, but when a book is using something that you happen to have a really strong personal experience with and they portray it badly, it gets under your skin. And I know that there must be people out there who have this for other things, you know, when your industry gets misrepresented in some ways. And it's not that she's done harm to the tightwire community or whatever, it's just that it's not accurate. And that, as somebody who knows what that is, it just annoyed me. And it made scenes that she was trying to use the tightwire to do something, all I could focus on was the fact that it was wrong. So I feel like that didn't help this book at all. So those are all the books that I read in October that were not for Spookathon, and I'm just going to run through really quickly now my Spookathon books and what I thought of them. If you've already seen my wrap up for Spookathon, you can pretty much end the video here, and I'm just going to go bye to you. Okay, in Spookathon I read 7 books, and we're just going to run through them as quickly as we can. This is not in any particular order, this is just the pile that I have next to me. I've got the Backman books by Stephen King. I actually read The Long Walk in this one specifically. I thought the characters in this book were probably the strongest part of it. It was well paced, it was very interesting, it had a really strong ending. If anything, I would have liked a bit more from the ending. I read Lock and Key Volume 1 and 2. This is by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabrielle Rodriguez. This is a wonderful graphic novel series that is set in a house that has lots of keys and doors and mystical creepy things going on. There's a whole linking back to like a whole past conversation with the character's dad, and also it's really, really cool. I think the artwork is gorgeous. I thought the pacing was brilliant. I think the ideas are really cool, and I'm really keen to see what happens in volume 3 and 4. We have Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. This is just a really classic detective crime story with the slight twist of the fact that you do have conversations and chapters from the killer's point of view in this. It's a retired detective chasing down the one that got away. I think that it's a perfectly solid crime book, but nothing crazy special given what the crime genre kind of does now. But it was a very enjoyable read, and I am keen to approach book 2 because this is actually number 1 in a trilogy. Then I have I Am Behind You by John Avenger Linguist. I've butchered that and I'm very sorry. This one started off really strong, super creepy, had loads of supernatural elements going on, then steered into the ridiculous, and then nosedived completely into the incomprehensible. I would not recommend this book particularly. It might be a translation issue, it might just be that the story isn't for me, so probably the weakest one of the Spookathon collection. Joe Hill's Strange Weather is a collection of 4 novellas from my favourite author Joe Hill. I think of them, Loaded is the strongest one, which looks at American gun culture. Personally, I think the novella format is not one that I can get on board with, and I would have liked Joe Hill to take these books and these story ideas and make them to fully blown books. But generally, overall, the ideas and stories were more enjoyable than not, so I think it wins on just sheer average alone. The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden, my all-time favourite one from the Spookathon list, and probably should have gone in with the favourites books from before. This is book 2 in her Winter Night trilogy, which is a medieval Russian folklore kind of story, and it is phenomenal. Such a good read. More action than the first book and less mythology, but it definitely brought in those folklore elements towards the end, and just the characters that you get to see and the character development overall is wonderful. I love this series and I cannot wait for book 3. And then I think the final one that I read in Spookathon is Toil and Trouble, 15 Tales of Women and Witchcraft. This is an anthology, it's YA, and it is edited by Jessica Spotswood and Tess Sharp. I thought that this was brilliant. I listened to an audiobook and the audio narration is amazing. Obviously with a collection and anthologies, you're going to have variations of which ones are good and which ones are bad. Generally, I think, again, this one averaged out to being a really strong collection. There were some that I really liked that were looking at more sort of feminist issues. There's some excellent ones from more of kind of a Latin culture. There were some really nice ones just bringing in modern day technology, which I thought was excellent. I generally preferred it when the books were looking at relationships between just whether it be between 2 women from either a platonic or a romantic point of view, or looking at romantic relationships in general. There are a few that were based on strong group friendships that really don't resonate with me personally, just because that's not something that I have had strongly in my life. But there's something for everyone in this, and it does brilliantly for representation. Like, it just ticks the boxes. I think that's it. I don't know what's happening anymore. Life has gone really crazy. I have an exam in like 5 days time, and then 2 days after that I'm going on holiday for like a long weekend, and I just have no time to do anything at all. So you're getting slightly rushed, slightly frantic videos for the next few. I'm really sorry, but after I get back I do have a series that I've been working on for a while that I'm super proud of, that I think will be a little bit more thoughtful and thought out than some of the rambling you've had today. So have a great reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye!